I was paralyzed when my boss pulled my wife to dance with him at the company party and kissed her in front of everyone. That wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a slip. It was a statement. I ran towards him, overcome by an impulse that burned me inside like acid. He just laughed. Laughed. And then he said, with a mocking smile, as if he were doing me a favor, "Don't be jealous, she loves me more than you." Those words weren't just a provocation. They were a sentence. They tore my chest apart from the inside, and made me see what I had refused to see for a long time. I was married to a woman who no longer saw me as a man. And worse, maybe she never had. That night was the point of no return. But it didn't end there. When we got home, she cried. She said it was a moment of weakness. That she was confused. That kiss meant nothing. That I didn't understand how invisible she felt at home. That she needed attention. That it had just been a kiss. But it wasn't about the kiss. It was about everything that led up to that kiss. I looked at her and no longer recognized the woman I married. And perhaps the most painful thing was realizing that, at some point, I stopped being the man she fell in love with. But no, I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I just looked at her and said, "All good." It was the only word I could manage to say. But inside, something was ignited. A different silence. It wasn't the silence of submission, it was the silence of strategy. And that's when I decided, she didn't deserve a simple divorce. She deserved to understand, piece by piece, what it was she had destroyed in exchange for a few promises whispered in her ear by a man who saw nothing beyond the next opportunity to inflate his own ego. From that night on, I started to observe. Every message, every call, every glance exchanged in the office, every time she smiled more at her cell phone than at me. And I started to find clues. Small, almost imperceptible, but enough to draw a pattern. Her boss was arranging for me to leave the company, and she was the main pawn in the game. She had betrayed me twice, as a wife and as a coworker. And she still had the nerve to lie next to me every night feigning innocence, with that body that no longer belonged to me, but that still tried to use the same gestures to convince me that everything was fine. I started recording conversations, backing up emails, and cross-referencing diaries. What I discovered was more disgusting than I could have imagined. She had passed on confidential reports that only I had access to, under the pretext that he needed to review them before the board of directors. When I confronted her, she denied it. She cried. She called me paranoid. She hugged me from behind while I tried to sleep, whispering that I was destroying our marriage with my suspicions. But deep down, she knew. She knew that I knew. And when a woman knows that you've seen her naked soul, she starts to get scared. And she started to feel that fear. I saw it in her eyes. It wasn't easy. It hurt. A lot. I wasn't the kind of man who cheated, who played dirty. I believed in loyalty, in commitment. I believed that love was made of daily choices. But in that moment, I discovered that the pain of betrayal is like a virus, it enters silently, but when it spreads, it transforms you. And I transformed. Not into someone bitter, but into someone ready to stop being the fool in the story. Because she didn't betray me with just one kiss. She betrayed me with every choice she made to get closer to that man. And he didn't want her. He wanted to destroy me. I was the obstacle. I planned everything in silence. I walked away without her noticing. I strengthened my contacts in the company, gathered allies, and talked to people on the board. Everyone already suspected him, but no one had the courage to confront him. Until I put the evidence on the table. I didn't just expose them both. I turned the tables. While she smiled, believing that her new position was the result of recognition, I had already prepared the ground for her downfall. The day the two of them were called to an extraordinary meeting, she called me desperate. Crying. Pleading. Telling me that it was unfair, that they were trying to sabotage her. That the boss was putting everything on her back. I listened to everything in silence. And then I asked, "Do you still love him more than me?" She was speechless. For the first time, she understood the depth of her misery. And there, in the silence on the other end of the line, I heard the sound of destruction. The sound of a castle crumbling, the castle she herself had chosen to build on sand. After the fall, she tried to come back. She tried to win me back with the same weapons as before, sweet words, memories of happy times, promises of change. She said she felt ashamed. That she had lost everything. That only now she realized the value of what we had. That her boss never loved her. That he used her. And me? I was already far away. I no longer felt angry. I felt relief. Because time, sometimes, doesn't heal. But it teaches. And I learned that loving someone doesn't mean sinking with them. It was then that she discovered that I was no longer alone. That another woman had crossed my path. Someone who didn't need to cheat to feel alive. Someone who looked me in the eyes as if she saw my entire soul, and not just the position I held. She knew this when she tried to ask me out for coffee and I said I couldn't, that I had dinner. When she tried to touch my hand, and I recoiled. When she tried to remind me of who we were, and all I could remember was who I was. You bring me back after her. And that hurt her more than any betrayal. Now, she walks the company's corridors like a shadow. You carry the weight of what you lost and what you will never get back. Because there are wounds that life does not heal. Only displays. And hers was on display for all to see. I, on the other hand, started over. No rush. Not with a thirst for revenge. But with dignity restored. I didn't need to take revenge. Life took care of that. But what no one knows is that, behind all of this, there was a plan that I never revealed to anyone. A hidden detail. A subtle move that sealed her fate, and his, definitively. A final move that still brings a silent smile to my face today. A detail that, if I tell you now, might change everything you think about what justice is, and what love is. Because not all betrayals end in tears. Some end in applause. And others, with a letter hidden in a safe. Are you sure you want to know what was in that letter? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize betrayal. The stories you will hear are totally fictitious, but reflect hard truths about how infidelity destroys homes, feelings, and entire lives. Our goal is clear: show the emotional, real, and irreversible consequences of betrayal. Get ready, because what comes next is a story intense, shocking, and unforgettable. Jonathan and Emily were the kind of couple that their friends would point to as an example. He, an operations manager at a medium-sized multinational, had always been discreet, meticulous, and kind. She, a rising project analyst at the same company, exuded charisma, lightness, and an intelligence that was effortlessly captivating. Together, they seemed to balance each other like two poles that, despite being distinct, complemented each other in an invisible dance of support and complicity. Married for 9 years, they had built a seemingly solid life, guided by mutual respect, admiration, and shared goals. There were no children, but the plan was there, saved for a time that had not yet arrived, and perhaps this was also a reflection of the nature of their relationship: everything in its own time, with responsibility, consideration, and care. The house they shared, bought with effort and years of saving, reflected this same balance: minimalist, comfortable, without excesses, but with details that revealed good taste and care for the home. Jonathan cultivated the habit of making coffee every morning while Emily finished getting ready for work. She, in turn, took care of the evening details: dinner, the light aroma it left in the room, the playlist she created with soft music for them to listen to together as they ended another day. Small gestures that, over the years, became silent symbols of a life well lived together. At the office, they maintained a professional demeanor. It was common knowledge that they were married, but there was never any exaggeration, public affection, or any demonstration that could raise suspicions of favoritism or conflicts of interest. There, both were competent, focused, and, above all, respected. Emily, with her sharp intelligence and leadership skills, had been standing out in high-profile projects. Jonathan, more reserved, was known for his efficiency and ability to keep teams cohesive under pressure. This dynamic earned them admiration, not only for who they were individually, but also for what they represented as a duo. They were seen as the epitome of partnership, both inside and outside the professional environment. The friendships they cultivated outside of work also followed this line of stability. Dinners with friends, short weekend trips, family birthdays, everything seemed carefully balanced. There were no big explosions or apparent dramas. But, as in every relationship, there were silent gaps. Jonathan, although loving, had become increasingly introspective as the years went by. He carried the weight of responsibility in his eyes, spoke less about what he felt and immersed himself more and more in spreadsheets, meetings and strategies. Emily, on the other hand, began to miss the lightness that had brought them together in the beginning. Her eyes, still bright, constantly searched for signs that the enchantment had not been lost. And even without verbalizing it, there were nights when they lay side by side with completely disconnected inner worlds. This silent distance began to grow subtly. First, there were the inconsistent schedules. Then, there were the long silences between one conversation and the next. Emily began to dedicate herself more fully to the company's projects, often extending her working hours, participating in committees, and taking on new responsibilities. Jonathan didn't complain. In fact, he saw this as a demonstration of strength and determination. He was proud of his wife and never felt threatened by her growth. However, this silent pride hid a hint of discomfort that he himself couldn't name. It wasn't insecurity. It was more like something was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to contain it. During company meetings, especially those led by the CEO, Emily was notoriously stared at. It wasn't the kind of invasive or vulgar kind of look. It was an almost reverent kind of attention, which came with public praise, invitations to participate in strategic projects, and an increasing role in high-level decision-making. Jonathan noticed. And although he never said anything, something inside him began to react with an uneasiness that he preferred to ignore. After all, she deserved the recognition. She had always been brilliant, hard-working, committed. If anyone should feel threatened, it was his boss, not him. Company parties were always big events, filled with long speeches, background music and a formality carefully disguised as relaxation. They were opportunities for celebration and, at the same time, a showcase for consolidating alliances, closing deals and reinforcing roles within the corporate hierarchy. Emily loved these occasions. She dressed elegantly, exuded confidence and knew exactly how to move around, with a subtle smile, attentive eyes and an impeccable posture. Jonathan, more reserved, accompanied, followed protocol, chatted with colleagues, but preferred to observe rather than stand out. Even so, he made a point of being present. He was the kind of husband who respected his wife's presence, even when she seemed to shine alone. In the moments when they were alone, there was still affection. A touch of hands during dinner, an exchange of glances when sharing a glass of wine, a tight hug on difficult days. But something had changed. Time, responsibilities, routine, everything seemed to have drained away part of the passion that was once palpable. Still, neither of them talked about it. Both pretended not to notice the weight of the silence that, little by little, took the place of spontaneous conversations. And this absence of conflict, paradoxically, was what most distanced them. Because when there is no more fighting, there is often no more energy to fight. Emily began to receive more and more invitations to informal meetings, after-hours get-togethers, and dinners with the top brass. Jonathan, true to his style, would just smile and tell her to enjoy it. He would tell her that he trusted her. That he knew her potential. But as he closed the car door and watched her drive away, he felt a kind of emptiness that he couldn't explain. It wasn't fear. It was more like he was falling behind in a race he didn't even know he had started. And maybe, deep down, that's exactly what it was, a race for attention, for recognition, for validation. A race he had never been interested in participating in. Time went by, the days passed with the same rhythm. At work, Emily was standing out. She received more and more attention, public praise, invitations to represent the company at external events. Jonathan was proud, of course. But there was no longer time to share these achievements in an intimate way. Dinners were getting shorter and shorter, conversations more formal. Even weekends began to be filled with different commitments, agendas that didn't coincide, priorities that no longer crossed. And yet, there were no arguments. Just a growing silence. One night, when Jonathan came home after a long day, he found the living room empty, the music playing low, and a half-empty glass of wine on the table. Emily had left early for a dinner with the board. He had known. She had warned him. But as he looked at the solitary glass and the reflection of the living room lights on the glass, he felt a tightness in his chest. Not with anger, or jealousy. But with loss. As if, somehow, the home they had built was no longer theirs. As if, without realizing it, they had become two strangers passing each other in the hallway and smiling politely. The next morning, Emily was in high spirits. She told him about the dinner, about the company's future plans, about the possible international expansion. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, as if she were part of something bigger. Jonathan listened in silence, smiling, nodding, genuinely trying to share her enthusiasm. But inside, something in him was holding back. Not out of envy, but because he no longer knew what his role in this story was. The following weeks followed this pattern. Distances disguised as commitments, absences disguised as autonomy. And although they still slept in the same bed, they no longer dreamed the same dreams. Not because of one or the other, but perhaps for the simple fact that sometimes love doesn't die with screams or explicit betrayals. It fades away in silences, in averted glances, in dinners where the dessert is absence. And it was in this context that the company's big end-of-year party began to be organized. An event that everyone was eagerly awaiting, where promotions, strategic changes and tributes would be announced. Emily would be one of the honorees. Jonathan knew this. And even with a heavy heart, he made sure to accompany her. After all, that night would be special. He just didn't imagine how special it would be. He didn't know it, but at that party, not only would Emily's career take an unexpected turn. There, in front of everyone, something would happen that would change the course of their lives forever. And it wouldn't be her promotion. It would be something much more personal. Much more profound. Much more devastating. The night of the party arrived with the weight of everything that had been building in silence. Emily dressed elegantly, choosing a fitted wine-colored dress, made of light fabric and an impeccable fit, which outlined her figure with an almost calculated sophistication. Jonathan, in his dark suit and discreet tie, looked at her with a mixture of admiration and strangeness. She was beautiful, without a doubt. But she was also distant, as if she had already disconnected from him at some point that he could not map. On the way to the venue, they talked about trivialities, the traffic, the planned menu, the colleagues who would be present. He avoided showing any discomfort, maintaining his composure with surgical precision, as if there was something inside him that needed to be preserved at all costs. But behind that serene look, Jonathan's heart was beating with a premonition that he could not name, an uneasiness that had been growing since the previous days and that gained strength as they approached the main hall. The venue was spacious and luxurious, with impeccable decor and soft lighting that highlighted every detail. Guests arrived with smiles and rehearsed greetings, while the sound of jazz filled the room like an elegant backdrop. Emily soon stepped aside to greet her fellow board members, and was received with enthusiasm and praise. Jonathan stood near the bar, watching. It wasn't jealousy he felt, it was something else, more subtle and much more corrosive, the feeling that he no longer belonged in that space next to her. Amidst raised glasses, exchanged glances and low-voiced laughter, He noticed a dynamic between Emily and the CEO that had long since gone beyond formality. The disguised touches, the overly long glances, the way she leaned in slightly to listen to him, as if he were saying something too precious to be lost among the surrounding voices. Jonathan observed everything with the calm of someone who knows that something important is about to happen, but doesn't yet know how to react. During dinner, they sat at separate tables. Emily was with the board of directors, next to the director, and Jonathan was with some colleagues from the department. The exchange of glances between them was brief, almost formal. The food was impeccable, the wine was served with precision, but the taste seemed distant. He tried to participate in the conversations, smiled when necessary, made pertinent comments, but inside, everything seemed to be on hold. Time moved forward strangely, as if the universe were preparing to interrupt an established routine with a bang that would change everything. When the lights dimmed and the sound stopped for the speeches to begin, Jonathan fixed his eyes on the stage. Emily was called, praised for her contribution to strategic projects, and applauded enthusiastically. She walked up to the stage with confidence, thanked everyone with chosen and emotional words, mentioned the team, the support received, the importance of being part of something so great. And finally, she looked directly at the director, with a smile that was not just one of gratitude. Jonathan felt that gaze like a sharp knife, something inside him broke, but he kept his face serene, as if he was watching a play whose ending he already knew. The music filled the room again. The speeches were over and now everyone was dancing and celebrating. Jonathan walked away from the bar and toward the side garden, where the low lights and fresh air offered a haven for those seeking silence. He stood there for a few minutes, trying to gather his thoughts, trying to find an explanation for the growing sense of exclusion that was haunting him. When he returned to the ballroom, the atmosphere had become more lively. Some people were dancing, others were laughing loudly, and the director was in the center of the dance floor, inviting the employees to dance. Emily was nearby, smiling. And then it happened. The director pulled her hand with confidence and ease. Emily hesitated for a second, perhaps out of reflex, perhaps out of conscience, but soon gave in to the invitation. The two began to dance, at first at a certain distance, then with a closeness that left no room for ambiguous interpretations. Jonathan, standing on the sidelines, felt the blood move violently within his body. The voices around him faded, the faces became blurs, and all that remained was the image of his wife dancing with her boss, smiling in a way he hadn't seen in months. And then, like in a film where time slows down, the final gesture, a kiss. Quick, direct, public. A kiss that made no apologies, that feared no witnesses. A kiss that told Jonathan everything he needed to know. The world stopped for a moment. The air became thin. Jonathan's mind tried to deny what his eyes had registered, but it couldn't. Something inside him broke completely. He walked with firm steps to the center of the dance floor, pushed whoever was in his way, and stared at the director with a look filled with deafening silence. Emily froze. The director smiled, perhaps thinking that this was still a game. But when Jonathan pushed him, the tension tore. The guests around him moved away, and the director, with provocative calm, said something that caused time to split into two irreversible halves. Don't be jealous. She loves me more than you. Emily tried to intervene, but the words wouldn't come. Jonathan, staring at the man in front of him, felt a mixture of humiliation and clarity. It wasn't just anger. It was the painful confirmation that he had been betrayed in a calculated, public, blatant way. And that, somehow, she was allowing it. The room fell silent. The faces around him alternated between shock, discomfort, and murmurs. Someone tried to call security, others just watched, paralyzed. Jonathan didn't answer. There were no more words. He just turned and left. He walked down the main hallway, through the bright lobby, through the revolving door, without looking back. Outside, the night air seemed different. Cold, sharp, but paradoxically liberating. He felt his heart pounding, not out of love, but out of finality. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he no longer had to pretend. No longer had to bear the weight of a relationship that no longer existed. The image of the kiss repeated itself in his mind like a throbbing wound. The director's words echoed like poison. But even there, in the midst of his collapse, Jonathan felt something being born. Something he couldn't yet name, but that was already moving inside him. As he walked away from there, he didn't know exactly what he would do the next day. But I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The marriage, the business, life as I knew it, everything was about to be redesigned. And what he didn't know yet was that there was a hidden detail behind that betrayal, a silent piece of a bigger game, a truth that had not yet been revealed. A truth that would change everything. Forever. He woke up that morning with dry eyes but a burning throat. There were no tears, no fresh pain. There was only the full awareness that something had died inside him, something that would never come back. Jonathan spent hours silent, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his cold cup of coffee as if time had stood still. Emily didn't come back that night. Nor did she call. The phone remained silent as if there were, on some level, a silent confession in her absence. The clock on the wall continued to tick away, the hands dragging with the slowness of a weight that no longer made sense. It wasn't anger that pulsed in his chest, it was a deep and silent form of disillusionment, something that seeped through the cracks of his soul and soaked every thought. He hadn't lost a wife. He had lost the woman he thought he knew. When she finally arrived the next day, there was hesitation in her steps. She wore a shy, restrained smile, carrying a gift wrapped in gold paper in her hands, as if she could bring color back to what was black and white. She tried to enter lightly, saying that it had all been a mistake, a stupid impulse, a lapse in judgment. She talked about drinking, about emotion, about pressure and fatigue. Jonathan listened to her in silence. She spoke as if trying to cover a gap with a piece of tape. And with each word, the distance between them became more evident. When she finished, he just stared at her for several seconds and asked if she was still in touch with the director. Emily hesitated, lowered her eyes and whispered that she no longer was, that she understood the gravity of everything. She said that she wanted to fight for her marriage, that she didn't want to lose him, that she missed him. But Jonathan was no longer the same. There was something different in his silence. There was no more pleading, no more trying to understand. He simply stood up, picked up an envelope from the table, and handed it to her. Inside were separation papers. Emily stood still, staring at the pages with trembling hands. He turned and walked into the hallway, opening the front door. That was when she said, in a low voice, with an almost childlike pain in her eyes, that she hadn't done it on purpose. That she just wanted to feel alive again. That she needed to be noticed. Jonathan took a deep breath. And then, with a calmness that hurt more than shouting, he replied that he needed to be respected. In the following days, she tried to get closer to him. She sent messages, left notes, waited for him in the parking lot. She told him she loved him, that she had made a terrible mistake, and that she would do anything to regain his trust. Jonathan responded politely, but without emotion. It was no longer about forgiveness. It was the realization that love had been transformed into something else, into a memory of something that had been good but now hurt. She also began to distance herself from the company. She requested a transfer to another department, discreetly organized her documents, and gradually erased the traces of her failed marriage. But what Emily didn't know was that there was something much bigger behind all of that. A hidden truth that Jonathan had discovered during his silent investigation. A missing piece to complete the puzzle of betrayal. Something he never imagined he would find. It was during a sleepless night that everything began to make sense. Jonathan was going through old emails on his home computer, trying to piece together the fragments of time between when Emily started moving in and when she was exposed at the party. In one of the folders, he found strange records. Leaked reports, confidential documents with digital traces that led directly to the wife's login. Initially he thought they were just coincidences, but with each cross-referencing of data, the pattern became clearer. Jonathan, without realizing it, had been sabotaged within his own company. The drop in performance of the projects he led, the missing reports, the questions from the board, everything had been meticulously planned. And the centerpiece of that plan was Emily. But not by choice. He kept digging, and found deleted messages, restored with a program he had installed months ago. The messages between the director and Emily weren't just personal. They were strategies. In one of the emails, the director instructed Emily on how to act, how to pressure Jonathan without him noticing, how to subtly destabilize him. She was reluctant at first, questioning the methods, but she gradually gave in, seduced by promises of promotion and recognition. Jonathan felt his stomach churn. This wasn't just marital betrayal. It was professional. It was ethics, it was integrity being torn apart. But that wasn't what destroyed him. What crushed him was the last message. A message filed as a draft, written by Emily but never sent. In it, she confessed to being exhausted. She said that the plan was going too far. That she no longer knew if she was doing this to please the director or out of fear of losing everything she had achieved. And then she wrote a sentence that burned Jonathan inside: "He still trusts me so much, sometimes I think if he found out everything, he wouldn't hate me. He would just disappear." Jonathan stood there for hours staring at that screen. That was the woman he had shared a life with. She had not only allowed the betrayal, she had helped build it with logic and strategy. But in that sketch, he also saw the reflection of a woman divided. A woman who had given in to the game, who had been manipulated, but who was not innocent. Emily had chosen every step. And yet, she hesitated. Too late. The following week, Jonathan gathered all the evidence. He printed the reports, organized the emails, and separated the audio recordings he had recorded. He went directly to the company's board of directors. He didn't speak as a betrayed man, but as a professional devastated inside. He showed what he had discovered and handed it over without seeking revenge. Only justice. The impact was devastating. The director was immediately dismissed. Emily was suspended, and an internal investigation was opened. The reputation she had spent years building collapsed in a matter of days. When she found out who had reported her, she sought out Jonathan. She went to his house, knocking on the door as if trying to wake a dead person. He opened it. He didn't say a word. She came in, stunned, her eyes red, and asked if he had really done it. He nodded. She burst into tears. She fell to her knees, saying that she had been pressured, that she had been led into something she never wanted. That he needed to understand. That she didn't want to destroy him. And Jonathan, with firm eyes, simply answered, "But it destroyed." Emily sobbed, unsure where to put her hands, unsure how to summon dignity amidst her shame. She tried to hug him, but he pulled away. She told him she had made a choice. And choices have consequences. It was in that moment, as she broke down in tears before him, that Jonathan felt the total absence of love. The feeling had drained away. There was no more anger, hurt, or sadness. There was only end. And in the end, there is silence. But what Emily didn't know was that Jonathan was no longer alone. That in the midst of the chaos, someone had emerged. Someone who didn't know about his pain, but knew how to welcome his silence. Someone who didn't see him as a victim, but as a man. And that revelation was yet to come. As well as something deeper. Something he had saved for the right moment. Because between the reports and the messages, Jonathan had discovered more. Something she never suspected he knew. Something she swore she buried. But secrets, even the best hidden ones, always find a way to emerge. And this was about to change everything. The week after the complaint, Jonathan made a silent decision: he resigned from the company. Not as an escape, but as a liberation. He left behind not only a toxic environment, but a history that no longer belonged to him. He calmly packed his belongings, walking down each hallway as if he were saying goodbye to an old version of himself. He did not announce his departure loudly, he did not make any speeches. He simply handed over the letter, thanked her with a restrained nod, and left. During the termination process, he avoided crossing paths with Emily, even though he knew she had been removed from her duties and was at home, awaiting the outcome of the internal investigation. It was as if fate was separating them into different paths, even though they both walked on the rubble of what once seemed so solid. A few days later, Jonathan accepted an invitation to lunch with a colleague from another department, someone who had always been kind to him, without ulterior motives, someone who showed an interest in listening, not just in being heard. Her name was Helena. She had a steady way of looking at him, as if everything she said was the result of much silent observation. During lunch, she said little, but she listened attentively to every word he said, not about what had happened to Emily, but about what he intended to do with his life from then on. Jonathan felt something different in that conversation. It was as if, after so long, someone was looking at him and seeing more than the man who had been betrayed. They saw the man who still existed, wounded yes, but whole, even though everything inside was being rebuilt. Meetings with Helena became frequent. Coffees that turned into walks, walks that ended in laughter, and laughter that, little by little, began to heal the pain. Jonathan didn't talk about Emily. Not because he wanted to forget, but because, with Helena by his side, the past no longer seemed to be the center of his story. He wasn't looking for comfort. He didn't want to replace anyone. He just wanted to move on. And with her, that wish seemed possible. There was a peace in the way she looked at him, the way she listened to him in silence, without trying to finish his sentences or mend his wounds. She was just there, whole, present, and that was enough. Emily, for her part, had sunk into a spiral of silence. Alone in the apartment they once shared, she wandered between the rooms like a ghost trying to find her own memories. Away from work, ignored by her former colleagues and avoided by most of her mutual friends, she spent her days reliving every gesture, every choice, every conversation. She called her mother, her sister, and 2 childhood friends. No call brought relief. Neither the words of support, nor the advice or the invitations to take a walk and forget. She couldn't forget. It wasn't just the loss that hurt. The weight of having built his own ruin hurt. One night, he decided to write a letter. Not for Jonathan, but for herself. He was trying to understand where he had started to get lost. The words came in fragments, as if guilt had torn the paper along with the ink. He cried, slept on the sofa with the letter on his chest, and woke up with swollen eyes and a soul emptier than ever. At the end of that week, Jonathan received an email from the company's legal department asking him to attend a final meeting about the case. They were officially closing the investigation and filing the documents. Despite having already left the company, Jonathan agreed to attend. He felt that there was still something pending, something that needed to be seen, said, sealed. Arriving at the building, he entered through the side garage, where access was more discreet. It was then that, as he turned one of the hallways, he found Emily sitting alone in one of the armchairs in the internal reception area, holding a folder on her knees. Her eyes were puffy, her face haggard, but when she saw him, she tried to compose herself. He stopped, took a deep breath, and walked toward her. She stood up, still without saying anything. There was a heaviness in the air that they both felt. As if each step had twice the gravity. Emily tried to smile, but couldn't hold it. They were face to face, after all, and nothing seemed enough to fill that space between them. Jonathan was the first to break the silence. He asked if she was okay, but his tone was neutral, almost formal. She nodded, her voice low, and said she needed to give him something. He opened the folder and took out an envelope. It was a letter. Handwritten. He said he had written it the day before, after having a strange dream in which the 2 of them were together in a different house, with a young daughter playing in the yard. She said she woke up crying, but she didn't know if it was sadness or regret. He handed him the letter and asked him to read it only when he was ready. Jonathan held the envelope, but didn't promise anything. He just thanked her with a restrained nod. The meeting with the legal department was brief. The case was closed, the director had resigned, and the company had committed to strengthening its compliance policies. Jonathan left with the documents in hand, without looking back. That night, alone in his new apartment, he opened the envelope. He read each line of the letter calmly. Emily talked about the days when she had lost her way, about the times when she had stopped listening to him, about how she had felt pressure to live up to the expectations that had been created for her. She said that she had not planned anything in the beginning, that it all started as a dangerous game that she thought she had control over, until she realized that it was just another piece being moved. She confessed that she did not know how to stop. And that when she realized, it was already too late. But what hurt the most was the end of the letter. She wrote that everything she did, including delivering the confidential reports, was under the director's direct instructions. But there was one last thing she had never told anyone. Something she had kept hidden from the beginning of her acquaintance with him. Jonathan read it carefully. She revealed that, weeks before the party, the director had informed her that Jonathan was being eyed by the top brass for an international position, a leadership position that would involve moving to another country. It was something big. Emily had found out before he had. And when she found out, for the first time in years, she felt fear. Not fear of losing him, but fear of being left behind. She wrote that she couldn't handle the possibility of becoming invisible. That his brilliance threatened hers. And so she agreed to participate in the plan to destabilize him. That if he were promoted, she would become nothing more than the wife of the successful man. And that, deep down, she could no longer bear living in the shadow of someone who didn't even know she shined. Jonathan reread the passage more than once. That wasn't just betrayal. It was emotional sabotage. It was ego, vanity, envy. And it came from the very person he trusted most. He felt a chill in his stomach. That revelation made everything make sense. The missing reports, the veiled questions, the unexplained flaws in their projects. Everything had been planned not only to favor the director, but to prevent him from growing. The woman he loved would rather erase him than allow him to grow up without her. And this truth, more than all others, was the one that destroyed him the most. He put the letter away, closed his eyes, and stayed there, in silence. During that night, he couldn't sleep. But he didn't cry. He didn't explode. He just sat on the balcony, watching the city in silence, with his breathing shallow and his heart tired. At dawn, he sent a message to Helena, "Shall we have coffee?" She replied with a smile. When he met her, he didn't mention the letter. He didn't mention Emily. He just held her hand and said he wanted to travel. To disappear for a few days. To see the sea. Helena smiled gently and said she wanted that too. So they started planning. A new beginning. No promises, no rush, just being present. Emily, days later, realizing that Jonathan would not respond to the letter, appeared in front of his new house. He knocked on the door, breathing heavily, as if the world depended on that conversation. But it was Helena who opened it. Emily froze. Helena, with a polite smile, simply said that Jonathan had left. Emily didn't know what to say. He just nodded, turned, and walked slowly to the car. And in that moment, he understood. Not just that he had lost it. But he was rebuilding something she could no longer touch. Because there are losses that teach. And there are losses that liberate. Jonathan had experienced both. And now, for the first time in a long time, I felt I was free to start over. No hate. No rush. Only with truth. And love. In the simplest, most sincere, and most inaccessible way for those who once chose shadow over light. The morning after Emily's silent visit, Jonathan woke up with a serenity he hadn't experienced in a long time. Helena's presence in his life was not limited to emotional relief, but to a symbolic milestone in the new phase that was beginning to take shape. There was something about the way she looked at him, the way she shared the silence, that conveyed a kind of respect Jonathan had forgotten he deserved. Sitting at the coffee table, he watched the light pass through the window and delicately outline Helena's face. It wasn't overwhelming love, it wasn't blind passion, it was something rarer and more necessary, peace. After so many storms, that moment of shared silence felt like the first genuine breath in months. And yet, within him, there were echoes. No longer of pain, but of reflection. The truth revealed by Emily had left him in ruins, but it had also opened his eyes to the complexity of human emotions. What to do with everything he had discovered? How do you deal with the knowledge that someone you love deeply chose to erase you so as not to feel lesser? The moral dilemma that was going through him was intense. Part of him wanted to leave everything behind, move forward with Helena, rebuild himself far from the rubble of the past. But there was another, quieter part that insisted on not keeping quiet. A part that was not content with institutional justice, that knew that the professional punishment of Emily and the director did not reach the real impact that all of that had had. Jonathan asked himself, night after night, to what extent it was possible to start over without looking back. And not because he still loved her, that feeling no longer lived in his soul, but because there was a remnant of humanity that prevented him from completely ignoring the fall of the one who had once been his partner. It was not forgiveness that he considered, but understanding. Because within her mistake, there was something deeper, the inability to deal with her own insecurity, with her own feeling of inadequacy. And this pain, although it did not justify, explained. And that placed him face to face with a disturbing dilemma: would it be possible to move forward in peace completely ignoring the pain of others, even if that other person was the source of his own pain? Jonathan started writing. Not letters to Emily, but loose pages that attempted to organize her own thoughts. The diary that began as a therapeutic attempt became a mirror. There, between scribbles and notes, he recognized his own mistakes, the absences he allowed, the silences he perpetuated, the choices that distanced him. She didn't take the blame for what happened, but she didn't position herself as a passive victim either. I understood that in every relationship there is a path taken by two people, and that often the cracks appear long before the first shock. Emily's betrayal hadn't started at the party, or in the emails, or in the reports. It had much older roots, planted in accumulated silences and unshared dreams. And realizing that didn't lessen the pain, but it gave it context. And context, however painful, brings lucidity. Meanwhile, Helena realized that Jonathan was in the process of transformation. She didn't demand answers, she didn't demand emotional exclusivity. She understood that wounded loves don't heal with the sound of new promises, but with space and time. And she knew how to offer both. On one of their walks, they passed by a park where a group of children were playing. Jonathan watched with a slight smile, and Helena commented on how much lighter he seemed. He replied that he was still learning to carry what was left. She just held his hand. She didn't need to say anything else. That was what he needed, someone who was willing to walk with him, without trying to guide him, without trying to heal him. Just walk. Emily, meanwhile, was sinking into a silent spiral of loss. She had lost her job, her reputation, her friends, and now she was watching Jonathan build a new life, a life she was no longer a part of. She saw a photo of Helena on a social network and smiled bitterly, but she didn't feel jealous. She felt something deeper, regret. Not the kind that seeks redemption, but the kind that carries the awareness of the damage done. She tried to reconnect with old contacts, but the doors were closed. There was no corporate forgiveness, there was no trust to be restored. The market in which she had excelled now viewed her with suspicion, and she wondered daily if she would ever be able to rebuild something close to what she had lost. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the biggest blow was not the loss of her position or status. It was the loss of Jonathan. Because he didn't go screaming, he didn't take revenge with scandals, he didn't publicly expose his pain. He just left. And that kind of abandonment, calm and definitive, hurt in a different way. Slower. Deeper. She started attending therapy sessions. I wanted to understand why he sabotaged his own marriage, why he chose external recognition instead of valuing what he had. And in the sessions, little by little, he unearthed old layers of insecurity, comparison traumas, fear of invisibility. He discovered that, from an early age, he learned to compete with everything and everyone. Who felt the constant need to prove something that she didn't even know what it was. And that, ultimately, confused power with value. There, on the couch, she cried for the first time not for Jonathan, but for herself. For having lost herself so much that she didn't recognize the woman she had become. For having destroyed not only a marriage, but his own image in the mirror. And this pain, although devastating, was also the beginning of a possible new beginning. Not from a relationship, but an internal reconstruction that she herself needed to undertake. Jonathan, even from a distance, knew about the change. A mutual friend told him about the therapy sessions, about her absence from social media, about the days when Emily disappeared from the social circuit. He listened, but did not react. He simply kept the information with the same neutrality with which one reads an old news story. There was no more resentment. Only distance. And this distance was comfortable. The trip with Helena took place on a rainy Friday. They went to a small coastal town, far from everything. They walked on the sand, talked about music, movies, politics, books. They did not talk about the past. Nor about the future. They were just there, together. And that was enough. One of the nights, Helena told a story about her father, a man she loved in silence and who was never able to say, "I love you." Jonathan listened attentively, and at the end, he simply said that perhaps love, sometimes, is just being there, present. She smiled, moved. And in that moment, something was consolidated between them. Not as a new cinematic love, but as a mutual decision to continue walking side by side, respecting each other's rhythms, fears and desires. On the way back from the trip, Jonathan passed in front of the old apartment where he lived with Emily. It didn't stop. He just looked out the car window and for a moment, he felt something like gratitude. Because it was in that place that he lived good times, and also there that he faced the worst. But now, that was just a memory. And the memory, although vivid, no longer held him back. Emily, that same night, opened a new notebook. He began writing his own version of events. Not as a justification, but as an attempt to understand. And, as he finished the first page, he wrote a sentence that marked the beginning of his own downward action: you don't lose someone all at once. You lose them little by little, and when you realize it, all that's left is absence. The moral dilemma Jonathan faced began to fade as he came to understand that forgiveness did not require reconciliation. That forgiving, sometimes, is just stopping carrying the weight. He didn't need to fully understand why Emily did what she did. I didn't need to solve all the whys. I just had to follow. And that's exactly what he did. Not in a hurry, not with answers, but with the calm of someone who knows that some pains cannot be cured, but rather transformed. And the biggest transformation he experienced was realizing that starting over is not forgetting. It's remembering without hurting. It's looking back without getting lost. And it is at this point in the story that choices become final. Because when one love dies, another can be born. But it only blooms when the ground has been cleared, when the old roots have been honestly pulled out. And Jonathan had done it. Now, finally, he was ready to live. To love. And to close the last chapter that still linked him to the past. Because even difficult stories deserve a dignified ending. And that end was about to come. Jonathan woke up on a Tuesday morning with an unusual feeling of lightness. It was no longer the weight of betrayal that shaped his first thoughts of the day, nor did the image of the past suffocate him. It was something else. A feeling closer to the full awareness that he had gone through a storm and, even though the scars still burned in his chest, he was finally on the other side. He got up slowly, opened the windows, took a deep breath and, for a moment, stood there, watching the movement on the street, the daily routine flowing with the indifference typical of big cities. He thought about how the world went on even when his personal life seemed to be in ruins. The indifference of time had become, curiously, his ally. Time helped him put everything in its right place, without rushing, without shortcuts. That morning, in particular, seemed to carry a different symbolism. It was the day he would, for the first time, visit Helena's parents. The invitation had been made simply, but with affection. Helena suggested that they spend the weekend together in the countryside, where her parents had a small, cozy house surrounded by old trees and much-needed silence. Jonathan hesitated at first, not out of insecurity, but out of respect for the time taken by feelings. He didn't want to seem hasty. But she, with her confident and gentle manner, reassured him. She said that she didn't need to prove anything, that she just wanted to share an important part of her own story with him. He accepted. He packed a light suitcase, put away a book he had been reading, and before leaving, he went to the porch, where he read the last pages of his notebook once more. There he wrote a single sentence: "The past taught me who I don't want to be. The present shows me who I can become." He closed the notebook and left it on the table, as if ending a cycle not with a full stop, but with a confident ellipsis. The road to Helena's parents' house was long and surrounded by landscapes that seemed to come straight out of a dream. Green fields, small farms, a sky that oscillated between clear blue and golden tones of late afternoon. During the trip, they talked about trivialities and silences. Helena spoke enthusiastically about her childhood, the stories with her father, her mother's care of the garden, the weekends when the house was filled with relatives. Jonathan listened with attention and enchantment. It was the first time in a long time that he felt included in something genuinely new, that didn't carry traces of what he had experienced with Emily. There, with Helena, it was not a shadow of what it had been, nor an attempt to erase memories. It was him, whole, present, building something else. Upon arrival, they were greeted with hugs and simplicity. The house was cozy, with smells reminiscent of childhood and voices that carried the comfort of familiarity. Helena's father was a calm man, with a soft voice and steady eyes. The mother, a warm woman, with a light laugh and always busy hands. Jonathan felt welcomed, not as a visitor, but as someone who had been expected for a long time. That night, after dinner, they sat on the porch. The stars dotted the sky with an almost magical clarity. Helena's father offered them wine, talked about the weather, about his years working at the old school in the city, and then, naturally, asked Jonathan about his life. It wasn't an invasive question, but a curious one. Jonathan spoke honestly about his professional career, about the projects he had led, about the pleasure he felt in seeing something grow through collective effort. He even spoke about his departure from the company, discreetly, without mentioning names, but making it clear that he had learned a lot from everything he had been through. Helena's father looked at him in silence for a few seconds, and then said, "Sometimes, we only understand who we are when everything falls apart. What comes next, if you have the courage, is reconstruction. And reconstruction is hard work, but it is what forms real people." Jonathan nodded. And in that moment, he knew he didn't need to explain himself any further. The next day, during a walk in the woods behind the house, Helena suddenly stopped, took Jonathan by the hand and looked him in the eyes with serene intensity. She said there was something she wanted to say. That she had been feeling this way for weeks, but she needed to be sure of what it was. With tears in her eyes, but without dramatization, she confessed that she was falling in love with him. That it was not an impulse, nor a need, nor an attempt to heal wounds. It was love, slowly emerging, in the right way. Jonathan remained silent for a while, absorbing those words. Then, with a restrained smile, he replied that he was also feeling something growing inside him, something different from anything he had ever experienced. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that he could, indeed, love again. Without fear. Without ties. With ease. Meanwhile, Emily faced a different kind of silence. His life had become a series of absences. The absence of work, meetings, goals. The absence of friends, of invitations, of relevance. But the worst absence was that of meaning. He woke up late, avoided mirrors, and ate his meals in silence. Therapy helped her organize her thoughts, but the pain was still there. In one session, he spoke for the first time about how he felt when he saw Helena at Jonathan's door. It wasn't jealousy, nor anger. It was the realization that she had been replaced not as a person, but as a role. That his presence was no longer necessary in his story. And that hurt more than any institutional punishment. He began writing a book, not about betrayal, but about how the choices we make out of fear lead us to destinations where regret is the only companion. He wrote in short chapters, as if trying to record every little epiphany that came to him between breakfast and dusk. Little by little, the pain gave way to something resembling acceptance. Not with resignation, but with humility. A month after visiting Helena's parents' house, Jonathan was surprised by a letter left at the entrance of his building. The envelope had no return address, but he recognized Emily's handwriting. The letter was simple, without frills. He just said that he was finishing a painful process and that, despite everything, he needed to thank him. "Thank you for being firm. For not coming back." Because it forced her to see herself as she really was. It ended with a sentence that stuck in Jonathan's mind for days: "The worst pain is not being left, it is realizing that no one wants to come back." Jonathan read that sentence one last time before tearing up the paper and throwing it away. Not out of hatred, but out of understanding. That chapter was finally over. That same week, he decided to write an email to an old professional contact. A company in another city had opened a position that perfectly matched his new situation. It was a challenge, it would require change and adaptation. But Jonathan was ready. He spoke to Helena, who, to his surprise, said she would go with him without thinking twice. She said that sometimes life tests what we feel, and that she was willing to face the unknown with him, if it meant growing together. Days later, they packed up their boxes, got rid of their old routine, said goodbye to friends, and moved on. The new city welcomed them with that mix of novelty and fear that every change brings. They rented a small apartment, but full of windows. And between simple dinners and furniture being assembled little by little, they began to build a new story. One that had no ghosts, no empty promises, just the silent commitment to be there, for each other. Jonathan, now, woke up with plans. He thought about the future with discreet enthusiasm. And he knew, with an almost poetic clarity, that everything he had experienced up until that point, the pain, the ruptures, the discoveries, were necessary for that exact moment to exist. And as the sun crossed the room and illuminated Helena's sleeping face, he smiled. Because, for the first time, he understood that there are new beginnings that don't need words. They just happen. And they change everything. Time passed without fanfare. Months turned into almost a year, and life, as it always does, found ways to continue, even amidst the ruins. Jonathan now woke up next to Helena with a peace that didn't need to be explained. The new house was simple, bright, with few pieces of furniture and many meanings. Every corner had a recent memory, an exchanged smile, a shared silence. They were writing a story without haste, based on something that no immediate passion could replace: construction. The nights were filled with conversations about plans, books, films, and trips that were yet to come. And little by little, Jonathan began to see himself as part of something new, something that was not a shadow of the past, but a light of its own. At work, he began to earn respect again, now in a different sector, with people who didn't know his pain, only his competence. He felt useful, whole. And more than that, he felt alive again. One rainy afternoon, he received an unexpected email from a publisher. An old friend, to whom he had sent excerpts from the diary he had written during the reconstruction process, had shown the contents to an interested publisher. The invitation was clear: turn everything into a book. Jonathan was reluctant at first. It was her pain exposed, her story laid bare. But he talked to Helena, reflected for days, and finally understood that perhaps sharing was not exposing himself, but liberating. He began to review the texts, rewrite parts, and delve deeper into others. And he realized, as he reread each line, that it didn't hurt anymore. The words that once carried wounds now told only of a journey. And a journey, when well told, becomes a mirror for those who listen. Emily, on the other hand, was experiencing the weight of rebuilding without an audience. The book she had started to write had not gone ahead. Her attempts to find a new job were failing one by one. Even with all her training, the trail of the scandal still followed her. She decided to return to her hometown and start over in silence. She worked for a while as a volunteer in a public library, organizing books and cleaning shelves. It wasn't what she had dreamed of, but it was what she could do. She lived in a small one-room apartment, where she gradually filled the walls with old photos, memories of a time when she believed that success would solve everything. There, far from the lights, far from the company, far from Jonathan, she began to see herself in a different light. Therapy continued, and in the most difficult sessions, she talked about how much she had lost herself trying to be what she thought was expected of her. One day, when she saw a teenager sitting in a corner of the library crying silently, Emily approached her, offered her a book and said, "We can't always change what happened. But we can choose what to do with what's left." The girl looked at her with teary eyes and smiled. And it was in that gesture, almost imperceptible, that Emily felt for the first time in a long time that she could still be useful. After the scandal, the former director of the company tried to reposition himself in another sector, but Jonathan's well-documented denunciation had closed doors that he thought would remain open forever. His reputation, built on power games and manipulation, collapsed like a house of cards. He tried to open consulting firms, give lectures, and sell his image as a corporate mentor, but his name no longer carried the prestige it once did. He ended up living in a remote neighborhood, far from the financial center that had once been his personal empire. Little by little, he disappeared from the networks, disappeared from the circuit, and today he is just a shadow of his former self, someone who traded respect for control and ended up without both. Jonathan's book was released with a modest print run, but gained traction for its authenticity. It was called After the Silence, and soon became required reading among support groups, book clubs and people seeking strength to start over. In the pages, he did not reveal names, did not seek revenge. He simply told a story of falling and rising again, of how love can be destroyed by insecurity, but how dignity can survive even the worst shipwrecks. He received messages from emotional readers, people who said they had found in those pages a mirror of their pain. And this silent response from the world was his greatest reward. At a book signing, already in the second book, Jonathan saw a familiar face in the audience. It was Emily. She was different. Thinner, her hair tied back, her eyes less bright but more genuine. She waited for all the readers to pass, approached the table and held out the copy. Jonathan looked at her with a mixture of surprise and serenity. She didn't apologize, she didn't cry, she didn't try to relive anything. She just said, "Thank you for being fair, even when you had every reason not to be." He nodded, signed the book with a simple dedication, and handed it over. Emily left without looking back. And that was enough. Nothing more needed to be said. Helena was waiting for him at the end of the event with a discreet hug and a long kiss on the forehead. They left hand in hand, talking about the trips they planned for next year. He didn't mention his meeting with Emily. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because there was nothing left to explain. And Helena, with her silent wisdom, understood without asking. That night, lying in bed, Jonathan thought about everything he had experienced. The pain that once seemed insurmountable, the betrayal that threatened to destroy everything, the shame, the anger, the silence, and finally, the peace. It wasn't the story he would have chosen to live, but it was the one that had made him who he was. And that, in itself, was enough. Life went on. Jonathan continued writing. Helena started a social project to support women who had been through abusive relationships. Together, they transformed pain into action, past into purpose. Emily, in turn, opened a small book club in the neighborhood where she lived. It was neither prestigious nor recognized, but it was useful. And that, for her, was enough for now. The former director. No one heard from him again. And perhaps that was the true end for him, oblivion. Their story ends here. With each one in the place they built based on their choices. Jonathan found love where he least expected it, Helena gave love the dignity it always deserved, and Emily learned, albeit late, that the shine you seek outside only hurts when there is no light within. Each one paid their price. Each one followed their own path. Because life is like that, it demands with precision, rewards with silence and teaches with pain. Now, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments, we really want to hear from you. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take advantage and subscribe now, activate the bell to receive more impactful stories like this one, and share it with someone you know will be moved by it. And before we finish, let this reflection resonate with you. Betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship, it destroys trust, identity, family and future. It's a silent earthquake that shakes everything that was built with love. The channel does not support any type of betrayal in any way. Here, we show the real and profound consequences of selfish choices, and how pain can teach, but never justify. Until the next story. And may it be, above all, true.